Across the endless grasslands stretching between the Black Sea and the Caspian, a silent transformation began to unfold more than 5,000 years ago. In the 4th millennium BC, this vast open world of windswept steppes and rolling plains became the stage for one of the most important cultural shifts in human history, a shift so profound that it would reshape the very demographics of Eurasia. On these fertile yet challenging lands, the Yamna culture took shape, born from a blend of changing climates, breakthrough technologies, and the merging of older traditions into something entirely new. If we journey back to around 3300 BC, along the gentle banks of what is now the lower Dnieper River, we find the site of Mikhailka, a place where archaeologists have peeled away layers of soil to uncover the earliest traces of what we might call proto-Yamna communities. Beneath centuries of sediment lay the remains of sturdy rectangular houses, their stone foundations suggesting that, unlike the wandering nomads they would later become, these people still spent part of their lives in a fixed place. Yet alongside these signs of settlement were clues that their lives were changing. Cattle were becoming increasingly central to their survival, pointing toward the mobile pastoral lifestyle that would soon define them. The pottery scattered through these ancient layers tells its own story. Gone were the simple round-bottom vessels of earlier farming people. In their place, we see new forms, pointed bottom pots and cord-impressed designs pressed into the clay with patterned cords. These weren't random decorations. They were marks of a new identity in the making. This shift wasn't sudden. It had been building for centuries through cultures like the Repin, which flourished between roughly 3700 and 3300 BC. Repin settlements along rivers such as the Upper Don already showed the seeds of the Yamna transformation. Here people were experimenting with large-scale herding, supplementing crops with meat and dairy from their animals, crafting a life that balanced flexibility with resource control. And then came a technological leap that would alter everything. Evidence from Repin sites like Chernyanka and Repin Kota shows they were among the first in this region to use wheeled vehicles. Clay models and preserved wheel fragments tell us these were solid wooden wheels, mounted on four-wheeled carts pulled by oxen. This single innovation broke the limits of human range, turning the open steppe into a manageable, connected world. For the first time, people could move their belongings and even their homes with relative ease, following their animals across far greater distances than before. But the environment itself played a decisive role in what came next. Around 3500 BC, the climate of the Pontic-Caspian steppe began to shift. Scientific studies of ancient pollen and sediment cores from the Black Sea tell us that rainfall decreased, forests shrank, and the grasslands expanded northward. What might have been a disaster for farmers was a spectacular opportunity for herders. With more open pasture and slightly warmer summers, perhaps a degree or two higher than today, the land could support vast herds of cattle, sheep, and goats. The longer growing season helped grasses thrive, but the drier winters made farming unreliable, nudging communities toward mobile herding strategies. The Yamna identity was not born from a single people, but from the weaving together of many strands. Two cultural threads stand out above all: the Kurvalinsk and the Sredny Stog. The Kurvalinsk people, living along the Middle Volga between roughly 4700 and 3800 BC, brought with them advanced metalwork and the beginnings of social hierarchy. From their cemeteries, particularly the one near Saratov, archaeologists have unearthed finely crafted copper tools, exotic shells traded from distant seas, and decorated artifacts made from bone and antler. These finds speak of an interconnected world of trade and craft specialization. They also reveal a tradition of burial that would leave a deep imprint on the Yamna, laying the dead in shallow graves covered with ochre, a practice rich in symbolism. Skeletal remains from Kurvalinsk tell us their lives were demanding and sometimes violent, with robust bones adapted to hard labor and wounds, suggesting clashes over territory and resources. The Sredny Stog culture, thriving between 4500 and 3500 BC around the Dnieper Rapids, contributed another essential piece to the Yamna puzzle: the domestication of the horse. Originally raised for meat, horses gradually became working partners. At sites like Derivka, horse teeth show distinctive wear marks from bits, suggesting people were riding or controlling them with organic bridles as early as 4000 BC. The impact of horse domestication was revolutionary. Mounted herders could watch over huge territories, moving with their animals across hundreds of kilometers, perfectly timed to seasonal grass growth. This mobility brought both economic advantage and a strategic edge over less mobile neighbors. Around this time, Srednji communities also developed innovative ways to process dairy, leaving behind perforated ceramic vessels used for cheesemaking, proof that milk had moved from the pasture into their diets in lasting ways. By the mid-4th millennium BC, the emerging Yamna culture had another defining feature: the monumental burial mounds known as kurgans. These raised earthen structures, sometimes small and solitary, sometimes enormous and visible for miles, became both sacred sites and political statements. The earliest examples, dating to around 3500 BC, often occupied high ground or key river crossings, places that commanded views and were steeped in meaning. Building a kurgan wasn't a casual act. It required coordinating the labor of entire king groups, hauling soil, stone, and wood to create long-lasting monuments. Many were expanded over time, beginning with a single central burial and later encircled by additional graves, each layer adding to its significance. At the heart of the largest kurgans, bodies were often laid in contracted positions on their backs or sides, accompanied by finely made weapons such as copper daggers, polished stone axes, and food stored in ceramic jars. These objects weren't just personal possessions. They were symbolic markers of identity, wealth, and social power. The positioning of these mounds across the landscape was anything but random. Clusters often marked fertile pastures, river fords, and the invisible boundaries between communal territories, serving as permanent statements of ownership and heritage. The grave goods themselves expose the widening gap between social classes within Yamna society. The richest burials, typically male, held imported treasures, carnelian beads carried from Central Asia, silver jewelry linked to Anatolian sources, delicate tools, and ornate weaponry. In contrast, secondary graves nearby were much simpler, with few or no valuable items reflecting a lower status in life. Burials also reveal gender distinctions. While men dominate the most prominent kurgan centers, some women were honored with lavish interments, their graves filled with copper ornaments, intricately decorated pottery, and tools hinting at roles in craft production or social leadership. Yet many other women's burials contained little, underscoring inequalities not only between classes, but also among women themselves. Piece by piece, over centuries, this blending of mobile herding, horse mastery, burial traditions, metalworking skills, and long-distance trade built the Yamna culture into a force that would shape the genetic and cultural makeup of much of Eurasia. These people, once tied to river settlements, now roamed the grass seas with herds, wagons, and horses, marking the land with their monumental dead and their enduring presence. The vast open steppes became not a barrier, but their home, an endless connected world in which they were the undisputed masters. During the Yamna rise, the foundations for their remarkable spread across Eurasia were being set in stone, or more precisely, in metal, wood, and muscle. This was not a civilization that stumbled into dominance. Their ascendancy rested on a potent combination of technological ingenuity, mastery over animals, and the ability to adapt tools into cultural symbols of power. From the older Kovalinsk traditions, they inherited the art of working copper, but Yamna smiths refined it further. In their skilled hands, lumps of metal were transformed into robust tools, durable implements, and distinctive weapons. Among the most iconic was the hammer axe, a weapon as functional as it was symbolic, made with a pierced shaft hole to perfectly balance the heavy head on its handle. It spoke of advanced casting techniques, metallurgy expertise, and the time-intensive labor that only a society valuing both war and prestige would invest. But the Yamna were not just warriors. They were engineers of movement. As the wheel rolled onto the stage of history, these people embraced it wholeheartedly. Wagons became more than transport. They were lifelines, storage units, and moving homes. Excavations of early Yamna settlements reveal a growing uniformity in how these four-wheeled vehicles were built. Solid wooden wheels attached to sturdy frames could bear immense weight, carrying not just essential supplies but sometimes an entire family's wealth. Oxen most often strained against the yokes, but occasionally horses themselves were harnessed, adding speed to endurance. These carts were not mere conveniences. They unlocked a new scale of mobility across the wide corridors of the Eurasian steppe, allowing Yamna communities to remain perpetually on the move without surrendering the accumulation of material possessions. As their world expanded, so too did their artistry. Pottery, while practical, became a canvas for cultural fusion. The Yamna blended decorative motifs from the various traditions they had absorbed, producing vessels with cord-impressed surfaces, raised bands called cordons, and distinctive rims with unique silhouettes. These pieces were more than kitchenware. They were instruments of storage, preparation, and in some cases vessels of ritual significance, placed alongside the dead as offerings or used in ceremonies that bound the living to their ancestors. Yet perhaps their most enduring legacy was not in clay, metal, or wheels, but in the invisible threads of language. Across the scattered plains of prehistory, the speech of the Yamna would spread, splinter, and bloom into what we now call the Indo-European language family, tongues spoken from the green fields of Ireland to the shores of India. Reconstructing this ancient proto-language has been one of the great achievements of modern linguistics, and its vocabulary reads like a mirror of Yamna life. Words that survive in languages as far-flung as Sanskrit, Greek, and German point to a shared origin. The root for wheel, farkqueglos, reappears in Sanskrit as chakra, in Greek as kaiklos, and in English as wheel. This is no coincidence. The timing of wheel technology's rise aligns precisely with Yamna cultural expansion, suggesting that this innovation spread alongside the people themselves rather than being reinvented elsewhere. The same pattern unfolds with terms for axle and yoke, which match across Indo-European languages in both sound and meaning, and the linguistic record makes it clear that cattle were central to their existence. A single term, reconstructed as guayas, meant cow in general, but the language also preserved separate words for a bull, a calf, and even oxen, a reflection of a culture deeply invested in livestock. Dairy, too, left its mark on their speech. Words for milk, butter, and perhaps fermented dairy products are embedded in the proto-vocabulary, supporting archaeological finds of perforated pottery strainers for cheese-making and jars with molecular traces of milk fats. Their horses, equally important, galloped into their language as symbols of strength and mobility. The Proto-Indo-European hioas meant horse, separate from any word for wild equids, while Marcos seems to have designated a dedicated riding horse. Verbs like rihioda, to ride, and associated terms for bridles and reins point to a community for whom horseback riding had become a specialized skill. This verbal heritage matches the archaeological record of the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BC, when Yamna sites along the Volga and Don rivers show intensive horse use, not just for food but as true riding and draft animals. Language also preserves a map of their society. The kinship vocabulary reveals a sharp awareness of family roles, with clear distinctions between relatives on the father's side and those on the mother's, a sign of a patriarchal system where descent and inheritance flowed through the male line. Terms for father, brother, and son hold core places in the proto-language, while words suggesting that women often married outside their birth clan align with archaeological evidence of female movements between communities. The title potis, meaning the male head of household, carried implications of authority and land rights, a linguistic echo of the richly furnished male burials dominating the central chambers of the largest kurgans. Their spiritual life is also etched into the language. The word Daius referred to the bright sky and its supreme deity, an ancestral figure who would survive in later mythologies, as Zeus in Greece, Jupiter in Rome, and Daius Pitar in Vedic India. This worship of the sky god is reflected in their burial customs. Kurgans consistently align bodies to face east, toward the rising sun, signaling rebirth and divine connection. Words reconstructed as Hafal Naputs suggest a system of ancestor reverence, where the dead remained potent presences in communal life, guardians and mediators to the supernatural. Kurgans themselves became the physical embodiment of these beliefs. Each mound was an artificial mountain, raising the dead toward the heavens. Within them, carved stone stelae, human-shaped monoliths with large staring eyes and hands pressed to the chest, stood sentinel. These figures, fashioned from local stone, appear to have represented deified ancestors, eternal in their watch over the living. The rituals that took place inside these burial chambers were elaborate and resource-heavy. Ochre, a deep red mineral pigment, was brought from sources hundreds of kilometers away and laid thickly over the earth in bodies symbolizing blood, vitality, and the promise of renewal. Sourcing such material required expansive trade networks, and its consistent chemical fingerprints across far-flung sites suggest a shared ritual code followed over vast regions. Placement of grave goods within the kurgans followed strict conventions. A copper dagger would be set near the right hand, arming the deceased for battles in the spirit realm. Ceramic vessels at the feet held food for the journey into the afterlife. Stone battle axes, sometimes unused and pristine, served purely as emblems of high status and divine sanction. But burial was not the end of the relationship between the living and their dead. Evidence of repeated visits to kurgan sites suggests ongoing acts of devotion. Additional ochre sprinkled over the mound, shards of deliberately broken pottery left behind, and animal bones from sacrifices. Through these acts, the Yamna maintained an unbroken thread of connection to their ancestors, believing that the departed could sway the forces of nature itself, bringing rains, ensuring herd fertility, or granting success in war. Social hierarchy was visible in these monuments. The tallest mounds, soaring up to 10 meters high and stretching 80 meters across, represented immense collective effort, often years' worth of work for entire communities. Such colossal tombs were reserved for the elite, while lesser individuals rested in smaller mounds on the periphery. The distribution of wealth inside, from imported silver and carnelian beads to humble, undecorated pots, offers a striking cross-section of Yamna society, where rank, lineage, and prestige loomed as large as the steppe sky above. Among the most imposing symbols of Yamna power were the monumental burial mounds that rose above the steppe like silent fortresses, each guarding stories of lives marked by wealth, influence, and war. Within the largest kurgans, the central chambers often held individuals laid to rest with impressive arsenals. Copper daggers, stone battle axes, ornate shaft-hole weapons, some burials boasting several kilograms of worked metal. These were no ordinary tools and ornaments. They marked their owners as people of consequence, patrons of artisans, and leaders of men. Such lavish deposits were only possible because these elites commanded not only herds, land, and warriors, but also the far-reaching networks of trade that funneled rare treasures across thousands of kilometers. From the sands of Gujarat came carnelian beads, their polished red surfaces gleaming against the bones of the dead. From the mountains of Anatolia arrived silver worked into clasps and pendants, and from the Baltic shores ancient amber, warm to the touch even in its long sleep beneath the soil. None of these materials existed naturally in the Yamna heartland. Acquiring them required sustained contact and mutual trust between distant elites. The striking uniformity of such prestige goods across territories suggests more than casual exchange. It points to an interconnected aristocracy that recognized one another's symbols of rank and operated within a pan-Yamna cultural sphere. The weapons in these tombs reveal not only martial culture, but sophisticated craft. Analyses of copper daggers from elite graves consistently find arsenic content between 2 and 4%, an alloying practice that hardened the metal, giving each blade more bite and longevity. Such precision could not have been accidental. It reflects specialized metallurgical knowledge and intentional smelting techniques. The consistency of these alloys over vast distances also raises intriguing possibilities. Perhaps there were central production hubs supplying key leaders, or else a widespread and deliberate sharing of smithing secrets among master metal workers. Tracing the copper itself tells another story. Its sources lay in the Caucasus, the Urals, and the Balkan highlands, all requiring organized extraction, dangerous journeys, and secure trade routes. The men buried in these rich tombs were not simply figureheads. Skeletal examination reveals wide-shouldered builds, with muscle attachment points showing years of physically demanding activity. Many carried reminders of past battles, healed fractures, bone depressions from blunt force blows, evidence of personal involvement in armed conflict. Their diets, reconstructed from isotopic analysis, skew heavily toward animal protein, in line with what one would expect from individuals at the apex of pastoralist wealth, surrounded by herds and feasting on meat and dairy. Everything about them, from the way they were built to what they were buried with, suggests that status came as much from prowess in war and herding as from heritage. Even the way their final resting places were built reflected both unity and variety. In the western ranges of Yamna territory, elaborate burials might be set within stone-lined chambers, roofs fortified by massive timber frameworks that required significant woodland exploitation and communal effort. In the east, over the more treeless steppe, simpler earth-cut graves beneath smaller mounds took their place. The divergence was practical, shaped by available materials, but the contents and rituals within remained strikingly similar across the whole region, reinforcing the idea that beneath local expression there thrived a shared Yamna identity. The metalwork for which they are so well known placed them ahead of many of their contemporaries in sophistication. The shaft-hole axe, one of their signature weapons, could not be fashioned by guesswork or trial alone. It demanded complex mold designs, often in multiple pieces, and a tight command over furnace temperatures to ensure a uniform casting. Beyond their battlefield use, these axes became instant markers of cultural affiliation. Their presence alongside distinctive pottery or burial styles is enough for archaeologists to identify Yamna influence far from its core lands. Their ceramics too served as flags of identity. While functional for cooking, storing goods, or transporting milk, the Yamna gave them surfaces alive with texture, geometric cord-impressed designs pressed deep into the clay by twisted fiber cords, removed only when the vessel was ready for firing. This technique was not mere decoration. The roughened surface made the pot easier to grip, especially when damp, turning beauty into practical advantage. Across regions, the decorative logic was unified, but the patterns showed subtle regional signatures, allowing archaeologists centuries later to read the movements and influence of particular communities. The Yamna toolkit was similarly fine-tuned to their mobile pastoral way of life. Bone needles, perfectly sized for stitching hides into clothing and coverings, antler tools shaped to scrape and soften leather, composite implements joining sharp stone blades to wooden or bone handles for maximum versatility. The designs of these tools recur from the Black Sea to the Volga, suggesting the movement of skilled makers who may have carried their craft from camp to camp, spreading consistency in form and function. Wear analysis tells us they were put to intensive use on hides, wood, and bone alike, the materials that formed the literal fabric of Yamna existence. But of all their technical achievements, the integration of wheeled vehicles into steppe mobility was perhaps the most transformative. Before the wheel, a family's range was limited to the distances its members could walk, with herds trailing behind. With the wheel, and specifically the robust four-wheeled wagons of the Yamna, the limits evaporated. Now an entire household, from the youngest children to the most revered elders, along with tents, goods, and food supplies, could be relocated in a matter of days. Oxen, most often in pairs or teams, provided the pulling power, and the wagons served as moving homes, while mounted herders rode alongside to keep livestock in line. This marriage of traction and riding mobility erased the old constraints that had kept earlier steppe people tethered to the nearest permanent water source. Yamna herders could now orchestrate seasonal migrations that leapt hundreds of kilometers, perfectly tuned to the cycles of pasture regrowth. Settlement archaeological surveys along the lower Don show patterns of occupation shifting with the seasons, with certain river terrace camps revisited year after year, always at optimal grazing times. The wagons themselves reflected a mastery of woodworking adapted to the rigors of the steppe. Solid wooden wheels, often between 0.5 meter and 70 centimeters in diameter, were crafted from 3 thick planks pinned together with pegged dowels, the seams reinforced with leather bindings, soaked in animal fat to keep them supple and resistant to cracking. Dense hardwoods like oak and ash served as hubs, their axle holes carved to exact tolerances and greased with animal fats to reduce wear during long treks. The 3-segment construction of the wheel distributed weight efficiently, providing enough give to absorb the punishment of rocky steppe terrain without shattering. Every part of the wagon served both function and durability. The body was a flat platform of interwoven slats lashed with leather thongs, springy enough to cushion against jolts while remaining strong. Side rails bent from flexible wood kept goods from sliding overboard, and stretched leather or woven fabric covers could be drawn over a hoop frame to shelter both people and supplies from wind and rain. Typical platforms stretched between 2 and 3 meters long, and 1.5 to 2 meters across, large enough to carry a household's portable world. Even the lumber for these vehicles tells its own tale. Dendrochronology shows that trees were felled in specific growth phases to maximize strength and longevity, a mark of studied knowledge about timber properties. What emerged was not just a piece of transport equipment, but a cornerstone of Yamna life, one that explains how they could carry their language, culture, and genes across the vast green-brown carpet of the steppe with such speed and permanence. Everywhere they went, the great herds followed. Cattle, the economic backbone of their world, dominated the kill sites and refuse pits of Yamna settlements. At places like Mikhailovka III, bones from bovines account for nearly 70% of all animal remains uncovered, with age profiles showing deliberate herd planning, keeping prime breeding animals longer, culling selectively, and milking females during lactation seasons for dairy processing. This was pastoralism not as subsistence but as finely tuned economic strategy, sustaining both daily needs and the long migrations that define their existence. The success of the Yamna way of life was not just a story of mobility and wealth, it was a science of survival, honed through generations of keen observation, selective breeding, and calculated resource management. At the heart of this system lay the herds, especially cattle, whose every detail of care and use was engineered for maximum return. The structure of these herds tells us a great deal. Young males, often culled before maturity, provided a steady source of meat, while mature females were zealously preserved, their value measured not only in milk but also in their ability to replenish the herd year after year. This calculated balance ensured the highest protein output without ever jeopardizing the breeding base required to keep herds sustainable over decades. The bones left behind confirm how intentional their breeding strategies were. Measurements of limb bones from Yamna cattle show animals that stood around 1.2 meters at the shoulder, up to a fifth taller than the domestic cattle of earlier Neolithic communities. This was no random growth. It was the outcome of deliberate selection for animals strong enough to pull heavily laden carts for weeks on end, yet still able to yield substantial milk, even under the strain of months-long migrations. These draft-bred cattle were, in themselves, a technological innovation, living engines that turned the wheel, both literally and culturally, of Yamna expansion. When paired with the wagons, the advantage became decisive. Oxen teams could drag the weight of entire households, tents, food stores, tools, and the wealth of a family. And thanks to their newfound mobility, herders could shift vast herds across hundreds of kilometers, arriving at fresh pastures before grazing depletion damaged the fragile steppe. This economic and environmental flexibility allowed herd sizes to swell in ways earlier pastoral societies could never sustain. Archaeological patterns point to family groups managing between 1 and 200 head of cattle, fortunes, in the currency of the prehistoric steppe. Equally vital was the ability to transform fresh milk into long-lasting nourishment. Scattered across sites such as Repin, Kota, and Levantsovka, archaeologists have recovered clay vessels with small, carefully drilled holes in their bases, 20 to 30 centimeters across. Their purpose was clear: to separate curds from whey, turning milk into cheese that could endure for weeks, even months, without spoiling. An indispensable food for long-distance travel, harsh winters, and times when fresh supplies ran short. Chemical traces inside these vessels, rich in milk proteins and fat signatures, prove the process. For the Yamna, cheese was not a luxury, but a lifeline, light to carry, dense in energy, and immune to the clock of freshness. While cattle were the undisputed foundation of the Yamna economy, horses played a more complex and evolving role. In the earliest centuries of their dominance, horses made up only a small share of total livestock, perhaps 1 in 10 animals. Yet these were no ordinary steppe ponies. The bones recovered from sites such as Bereshnovka and Poltovka show animals reaching 1.35 to 1.4 meters at the withers, noticeably larger than the wild stock still roaming nearby lands. This jump in size, paired with selective temperament, hints at breeding aimed toward animals that could bear riders or pull carts when needed. The debate continues among archaeologists as to how common mounted riding was in this first phase. Some horse teeth display the characteristic wear marks left by bits, suggesting bridling, yet the evidence varies sharply by region. It may be that in the Western Territories horses were chiefly pack animals or occasional cart pullers, while in the East, Earlier riding traditions were taking hold. Pulling a light cart or bearing saddleless riders required different levels of specialization, and it's likely the Yamna adopted these practices unevenly, refining equestrian skills over centuries rather than overnight. What is beyond dispute is that whether cattle or horses, the Yamna mastered the art of harnessing, literally. At rare sites where conditions have preserved organic materials like Ostani, archaeologists have found the wooden bars of yokes, crafted to arc gently over the shoulders of oxen, distributing weight evenly to avoid injuries during the endless pull across steppe terrain. These measured between 1.5 to 2 meters long, perfectly matching the anatomy of their beasts. Soft padding, likely of layered leather, prevented chafing, and was an art in itself. Yamna tanners used oak bark and other tannin-rich plants to work hides into durable yet supple leather, resistant to winter's crackling cold and summer's blistering heat. This harness leather was made tough, through a slow process of soaking, layering, and stitching sinew-thick seams, creating strength far surpassing single hides. Bronze fittings, cast with the same skill as their weapons, served to fasten traces and reins, distributing pressure across the structure so no single part would tear under load. Every detail, from curve to clasp, testified to intimate knowledge of both animal movement and the physics of transport. Behind this machinery of people, animals, and wheels was an equally intricate choreography of movement, the seasonal migrations that allowed the Yamna to control enormous grazing territories without exhausting them. In the Samara River Valley, we see clear patterns of winter and summer sites, protected riverbank settlements in the cold months, high plateau pastures in the warm season. These movements, often spanning 200 to 300 kilometers, were timed to the rhythm of the grasslands, ascending to uplands when the green was young and lush, retreating to valleys before the snows came early. The winter sites themselves reveal that these were not haphazard camps but planned stations for prolonged occupation. Semi-subterranean dwellings, sunk for insulation and lined with stone hearths, offered shelter from the icy winds. Such migrations demanded encyclopedic knowledge of the land, where waterholes held out longest, which fords were safe after the spring melt, which ridges were shielded from sudden storms. This knowledge, inherited through oral tradition, likely formed one of the most guarded bodies of Yamna cultural memory, passed from elder to youth around winter fires. As they moved, the Yamna left traces of their temporary stops along the migration routes. Archaeologists find these as clusters of post holes arranged in circles, the ghost outlines of portable shelters, accompanied by hearths choked with ash from short intense use and scatterings of animal bone, pottery shards, and discarded tools. Many such sites were reoccupied year after year, each season's camp laid upon the last like archaeological rings of a migrating tree. Herd composition, too, was a carefully managed equation, balancing the varied demands of milk, meat, breeding, and transport. An ideal cattle herd might have 60% adult females for reproduction and milk, 20% young stock of mixed sexes, and 20% mature males kept for breeding and as draft power. When autumn came and pastures began to wither, surplus males were culled, reducing the feeding burden through the lean months. This timing also ensured an infusion of fresh meat before the deep cold. Managing mixed herds of cattle, sheep, goats, and horses required deep ecological knowledge. Cattle, the pace setters, needed the richest grazing and most water. Sheep and goats, making up perhaps a quarter of the herd, were nimble browsers, content with rougher vegetation beyond cattle's preference, and valuable for their wool and milk. Horses, though fewer, provided mobility insurance, able to scout, pull, or carry as conditions demanded. This integration of species made Yamna herding systems resilient, a living hedge against drought, illness, and the erratic moods of the steppe climate. Through this blend of technological adaptation, genetic selection, material mastery, and environmental wisdom, the Yamna created a pastoral machine capable of sustaining vast migrations, feeding growing populations, and supporting a class of mobile elites who could project power across one of the widest cultural horizons in prehistory. Their livestock were not merely animals, but the engines of a civilization set on the move, and by perfecting their care, the Yamna set in motion a legacy that would ripple outward for centuries. Even in the rugged, unpredictable world of the steppe, the Yamna found solutions to challenges that might have halted less prepared peoples in their tracks. Nowhere is this clearer than in the way their carts evolved to conquer almost every obstacle the terrain could throw at them. River crossings, marshy ground, and the crushing strain of heavy loads were all accounted for in their designs. The wood was sealed with pine tar and beeswax, sheathing planks in a natural armor against moisture, so they would neither rot from within nor twist apart after repeated soakings. The rims of the wheels were strengthened with fitted iron bands, not common everywhere in the early stages, but remarkable where used. This simple innovation turned the wheel from a fragile wooden disc into something that could grind its way across jagged stone fields without splintering, distributing pressure evenly to keep the cart rolling long after others would have failed. These innovations didn't crop up sporadically or remain local curiosities. They spread, becoming part of a standardized design language recognized across the immense Yamna world. Whether in the Far East or deep in the Western Territories, wheel fragments from sites separated by thousands of kilometers have been measured and found to share uncanny similarities in size, curvature, and construction. Axles, too, followed common proportions, meaning a wheel from one cart could be mounted on another, an invaluable feature when traveling hundreds of kilometers from any settlement. Even the yokes that fit across the shoulders of their oxen were made to a familiar scale, ensuring that animals from one group could be harnessed to another's wagon without custom work. For a mobile civilization, this kind of interchangeability was a technological bond every bit as important as language. But the Yama story was about more than engineering. Its social architecture, like its carts, was built on a framework of well-defined roles and responsibilities. And nowhere was this more visible than in death. Across the wide arc of their lands, from the burial fields of Kotuluk to the grand mounds of Bereshnovka, patterns repeat with almost mathematical precision. At the heart of the largest kurgans, occupying the most central and honored positions, lie adult men, often accompanied by weapons, symbols of authority, and ornaments that spoke of their control over herds, land, and the loyalty of warriors. This arrangement fits a society organized along patriarchal lines, where leadership and wealth flowed down through male heirs, sons stepping into the places and privileges of their fathers. Yet the story of Yamna women is not one of invisibility, though many female burials lie on the periphery with fewer goods. Archaeologists also discover graves that tell a different tale. High-status women were interred in spacious wooden chambers, often with polished copper ornaments, elegant pottery, and finely made bone tools. Some carried bronze awls for sewing leather, others bone implements for preparing hides, and ceramic vessels tied to dairy processing and food production. Far from being purely domestic figures, these women seem to have overseen critical economic activities within the household, and just maybe, the labor of younger or lower status relatives. The mobility of these women was also striking. Using isotopic analysis of tooth enamel, scientists have shown that many female skeletons spent their childhood in places far from their final resting sites, their chemical signatures revealing entirely different geological origins from the soil in which they were buried. This matches the pattern of exogamous marriage, women moving between clans to seal alliances, exchange resources, and carry knowledge across hundreds of kilometers. In life, such unions wove a network of kinship that stretched far across Yamana lands. In death, they linked distant communities in shared descent and political trust. Even the youngest were folded into this ritual landscape. Infant graves, though rare due to preservation, usually appear alongside adult women, especially presumed mothers, suggesting a bond maintained into the afterlife. As children aged, the language of their burials changed. Young boys nearing maturity might be given miniature weapons or small tools, echoed versions of the grave goods found with adult males, as if marking their first steps toward the responsibilities of herding and defending. This gradual layering of symbolic objects shows how Yamna communities educated and marked their children's passage into adult roles, death reflecting the milestones of life. The pattern of life itself revolved around tightly knit extended families, often spanning 3 or 4 generations bound together into migrating units. Archaeological mapping of settlements like Mikhailka reveals small clusters of dwellings grouped around a central shared space, perhaps the hearth of the founding patriarch, where the day's processing of hides, dairy, or meat took place. Married sons did not strike off on their own, but built their homes close to their parents, creating interdependent clusters sharing animals, tools, and manpower. From this base, the Yamna built an economy rooted above all in the keeping of cattle. Across the open steppe, the evidence is unshakable. At major settlements, cattle bones dominate the discarded remains, forming 60 to 75% of all animal finds. The age profiles tell of a deep practical knowledge. Younger males slaughtered for meat when they no longer served a breeding or draft role, mature females preserved for their offspring and their milk. This meant continuous protein without diminishing the herd's future strength, a delicate balance that sustained wealth over generations. But cattle were never just walking food. They were the Yamna's engines and raw material providers, pulling carts, supplying skins for tents and clothing, bone for tools, horn for carved drinking vessels and ceremonial goods, and sinew that became thread stronger than any fiber rope. In every corner of Yamna material culture, cattle were present, silently sustaining nearly every task, journey, and craft. Sheep and goats expanded this pastoral base, thriving on land cattle could not use, rocky slopes and sparse scrubland, converting poor forage into rich milk, meat, and most valuably, wool. At sites like Poltovka, remains show that smaller stock made up about a quarter of the herds. Carefully managed to maximize fleece yield, they were sheared with curved bronze blades, designed to work swiftly and cleanly. These textiles, spun and woven within household economies, would have clothed the Yamna on the move, and perhaps served as trade material with neighbors. Horses held a more specialized, though no less significant, place, comprising barely 10 to 15% of domestic animals in most Yamna assemblages. They were selectively bred for qualities that went beyond survival: power in the shoulders and haunches, calmness under control, and endurance across long distances. Animals averaging between 1.35 and 1.4 meters at the withers were a far cry from the smaller wild horses still roaming Eurasia. Their uses, however, were not yet dominated by mounted combat. The earliest Yamna horses seem to have served primarily as beasts of burden, pack animals for moving goods, and occasionally harnessed to lighter carts. The leap from this to a cavalry-oriented culture would come later, and unevenly, with the eastern fringes likely riding earlier than the west. In every domain, whether the making of a waterproof cart able to roll across bog and stone, the negotiation of marriage alliances that spanned the horizon, the measured culling of herds to balance present needs against future growth, or the careful breeding of animals for tasks as diverse as milk-giving and war, the Yamna demonstrated a mastery over both environment and society. They were people who engineered not just tools and transport, but the very fabric of their lives to fit the rhythms of an unforgiving yet bountiful world, leaving behind mounds and artifacts that still tell their story millennia later. The image of the mounted Yamna warrior, so iconic in the story of later Indo-European expansion, did not emerge overnight. The art of true combat riding required generations of experimentation, gradual refinement, and the patient accumulation of skill. In the earliest days, horses served modest roles alongside the herds, but as centuries passed, the techniques of raising, training, and maneuvering them in battle evolved, setting the stage for a new chapter in steppe warfare. By the time that tradition matured, it would become one of the most defining features in the spread of these peoples across continents. While herding and mobility were the foundation of Yamna life, they did not turn their backs entirely on cultivation. Limited but deliberate farming complemented their pastoral economy, providing a buffer against the fluctuations of grazing and weather. In the rich soils of protected river valleys where winds were tamed by natural banks and water was plentiful, hardy cereals such as barley and wheat took root. Scattered across settlement sites, archaeologists find remnants of these grains alongside grinding stones and storage pits, silent witnesses to the small but important agricultural component in their subsistence. This blend of cultivated crops and roaming herds meant that in years of generous rainfall, the Yamna could add bread and porridge to their meals, while surplus grain could be dried and stored in a compact form, easy to carry on long seasonal journeys and invaluable in lean times. But the Yamna's reach extended far beyond their grazing fields and riverside plots. Their trading horizons stretched across half of the known prehistoric world, drawing resources from distant mountains, seas, and forests. From the rugged folds of the Caucasus came the gleam of copper, from the cold waters of the Baltic, lumps of ancient amber, from the far reaches of Central Asia, the blood-red glow of carnelian beads, and from distant coastlines, shells shaped into delicate ornaments. To gather such treasures required more than wandering curiosity. It demanded deep knowledge of safe routes, mastery of seasonal timing, and the ability to negotiate terms of passage with rival or allied tribes across hundreds of kilometers. Evidence suggests they even developed agreed systems to keep trade fair and consistent. Bronze weights from Yamna sites, almost identical in proportion despite being found hundreds or thousands of kilometers apart, speak to a shared understanding of measurement. These standardized tools of commerce allowed traders to set values for copper, livestock, ornaments, or hides with mutual confidence, smoothing exchanges and building trust across a world without written contracts. In their own way, the Yamna had laid the groundwork for the more complex economies that later Indo-European speaking societies would inherit and refine. Their settlements reflected a delicate balance between movement and seasonal stability. Temporary stopping places, used for only a few nights, left behind faint circular traces of post holes from portable shelters and the shallow blackened bowls of hearths, where quick meals were cooked. The meager scatter of broken ceramics, bones and lost tools in these places tells us how lightly they passed over the land during constant migrations. Seasonal encampments occupied for weeks or months, when pastures were at their best, left heavier marks on gently rising terraces above river valleys where floodwaters could not reach. The Yamna raised more substantial shelters, dug storage pits, crafted tools, and processed hides. Here, archaeological layers are thick with the debris of repeated visits. Pottery sherds from cooking and storage, ash from hearths fired night after night, bone from meals shared, and the quiet signatures of seasonal crafts. Elevated ground gave them a wide view of the surrounding grasslands, both practical for defense and perfect for gauging the condition of their grazing fields. In the depths of winter, the Yamna sought refuge in more permanent quarters. In protected valleys shielded from the worst winds, they built their most substantial dwellings, semi-subterranean structures reinforced with stone-lined walls. Stepping into one of these shelters in its prime would reveal thought-out design for both warmth and efficiency. The thick stacked stone absorbed heat from the day's fire and released it slowly into the chill nights. Above, a layered roof of beams, bark, sod, and hide sealed in the warmth while channeling away rain or melting snow. Inside, life revolved around the central hearth, ingeniously built with stone lining and vents that could be adjusted to draw or dampen the fire's breath. Around this hub, family life unfolded. Raised sleeping platforms lined the walls, piled with furs and woven blankets. Near the entrance, storage zones kept tools and supplies close at hand while deterring opportunistic theft. Workshops for mending harnesses, shaping bone tools, or producing winter clothing would have been active in these months, while stored fodder kept their animals alive when snow covered the plain. If their architecture was practical, their artistry was anything but bland. In ceramics, the Yamna created a unifying visual language of identity. Teapots were functional, for cooking, storing dairy or grain, or serving food, but they were also canvases for skill and ornament. The corded decoration, made by pressing twisted fibers into wet clay, gave a firm grip and at the same time traced geometric designs unique to their culture. Regional communities introduced their own flourishes, subtle changes in pattern or rim shape that let the knowing eye guess the vessel's place of origin. Yet across the steppe, the unifying style remained, a symbol of connection among scattered bands. Form followed use. Great storage jars with thick walls and narrow necks safeguarded precious supplies from pests and weather. Cooking pots with rounded bottoms settled comfortably into embers, ensuring even heat and preventing cracks. Drinking vessels, often finer in finish and richer in decoration, likely served in both daily meals and ceremonial toasts. The Yamna also adorned themselves. In graves we find copper and bronze spirals worn as bracelets, the bold rings of torque necklaces and hair ornaments crafted to gleam in sunlight. These were more than trinkets. They were declarations of identity and rank, the work of skilled craftspeople whose talents moved between communities. Bone and antler offered another medium, producing needles engraved with care, awls and scrapers polished smooth for the hand, and carved motifs of animals that might have carried protective meaning. Every tool had a purpose, but in Yamna culture purpose did not exclude beauty. Their tools, shaped for a mobile way of life, favored versatility and resilience. High-quality flint, gained through exchange networks, was knapped into standardized forms that cut efficiently but carried lightly. Handles of wood or bone fitted these blades, and when one edge dulled beyond repair, the parts could be replaced with ease from materials at hand. Composite construction, light but strong, made it possible to keep a toolkit ready for everything from butchering an animal to cutting leather for a harness, without burdening the caravan with excessive weight. Through all of this, in the trade routes stretching east to west, in the barley fields tucked into river bends, in the decorated pots set beside the hearth, and in the careful crafting of weapons and ornaments, the Yamna built a world that was both enduring and flexible, bound to the cycles of migration yet connected to lands far beyond the horizon. It was a system as resilient as it was beautiful, and it carried them, quite literally, into history. Among the many skills that define the Yamna people, their mastery of weapon making stood at the very peak of their material culture. Nowhere else in their toolkit do we see such a blend of technical precision, symbolic meaning, and cultural identity. The famed hammer axe, emblem of Yamna warriors, was far more than a simple blade fixed to a handle. Forging one required a complex casting process using multi-piece clay molds and the meticulous control of furnace temperatures to ensure uniformity and strength. Equal parts weapon and insignia, it marked its bearer as a full adult male, a defender of clan interests, and a member of a warrior elite whose authority was recognized across the steppe. If the hammer axe embodied Yamna skill in miniature, the construction of their kurgans, the great burial mounds, revealed their genius on a monumental scale. These were not casual graves, but the largest architectural feats of their age, built as long-lasting proclamations of lineage, power, and spiritual belief. Some of the most impressive stand at Bereshnovka along the Volga, their silhouettes rising dramatically above the plains. There, the tallest mounds reach 12 to 15 meters, with bases stretching over 100 meters in diameter. Such immense works began with a central burial chamber sunk as deep as 4 meters into the earth, a space then lined with massive stone slabs quarried far from the site and hauled in by teams of oxen. A ring of standing stones often marked the sacred heart of these mounds. At places like Poltovka's Great Cemetery, excavations have revealed concentric stone circles ranging from 8 to 25 meters wide, each made of limestone blocks weighing up to 200 kilograms. These were not rough piles carelessly arranged. Each block was carefully shaped with bronze chisels and wooden wedges, locked into place so that the load of the overlying mound distributed evenly without crushing the chamber below. The very precision of the cuts and placement points to specialized masons who, like master weaponsmiths, formed an elite craft class directing teams drawn from multiple communities. Inside the mound, the wooden burial chamber was just as carefully made. At Kurgan, one of the Kutuluk Cemetery, one such chamber measured 3.5 by 2.8 meters, assembled from thick oak planks, some as much as 8 centimeters thick, joined by mortise and tenon joints so tight they might still hold together today. Seals of pine resin, mixed with animal fats, closed any gaps against moisture and decay. Horizontal braces locked into vertical supports, anchored deep into the soil, created a frame capable of bearing the crushing pressure of earth and stone. Roofing these chambers was an engineering problem the Yamna solved with ingenuity. Master beams, selected for their strength according to the age and grain density of the oak, spanned the chamber's width. Across them lay shorter rafters set in a herringbone arrangement that spread weight evenly and resisted sagging. Over this went layers, sheets of birch bark, felted textiles, and packed clay, each with a role: waterproofing, insulation, and structural cohesion. Above it all, the earthen mound rose in carefully placed layers. Construction began with a basal spread of clay mixed with sand, leveled and compacted, using wooden rakes and bone-pounding tools. Workers transported the material in leather baskets, following a pre-planned pattern to ensure consistency in density and slope. The outer layers of the completed mound were capped with fertile topsoil mixed with organics to encourage grass growth, protecting the mound from rain and wind erosion, while giving it a softened, eternal silhouette on the horizon. A project on this scale was a community effort on a staggering order. Archaeological analysis of construction schedules suggests that the grandest kurgans consumed between 2,000 and 3,000 person days of work, enough to keep 50 to 100 laborers busy for weeks. Organizing such an undertaking demanded leadership capable of mobilizing people across far-flung settlements, feeding and housing them on site, and coordinating multiple flows of resources, from quarry stone to timber to bronze fittings. These mounds were therefore not just monuments to the dead, but to the living social systems that created them. The burials themselves followed a strict symbology that tells us much about Yamna beliefs. Across their vast lands, bodies were almost always oriented toward the east, their faces tilted to greet the rising sun, a gesture laden with meaning, connecting death with rebirth and the renewal of light. In male graves, the bodies were often placed in a contracted position, knees drawn toward the chest, sometimes with arms folded across the torso, sometimes lying straight with hands gripping a weapon. In high-status graves, those weapons were copper daggers with leaf-shaped blades or heavy stone battle axes, placed within instant reach as if the deceased would need to wield them on arrival in the spirit realm. Among the warrior elite, the inclusions could be lavish: multiple daggers, axes, perhaps a bronze spearhead or two, some nicked and battered from use, others fresh from the smith, purely ceremonial. This blend of worn and pristine pieces suggests a belief in the need for both tested tools and symbolic tokens in the afterlife. Female burials were more varied in their arrangements. Some women lay extended full length, others in contracted positions, and their grave goods reflected roles in life: copper ornaments, needle cases and bone awls, decorated ceramic vessels tied to food preparation, and in some cases, items like textile tools or leatherworking implements that hint at managerial control over vital household crafts. Ceramic offerings were standard, carefully placed to serve the needs of the departed. Large jars often stood near the feet, holding food for the spirit's journey: salted meats, grain porridges, and fermented dairy products. Residue analysis shows these offerings were prepared with surprising complexity, mixing herbs, grains, and proteins into recipes that could have been the centerpiece of elaborate funerary feasts. Such meals were likely prepared by designated ritual specialists, underscoring the sense that burial was as much a public performance of status and belief as it was a private farewell. Every aspect, from the quarried stones to the spiced dairy in the jars, worked together as a statement of who these people were. Through their weapons, they spoke of their readiness to defend in this life and the next. Through their monumental earthworks, they spoke of their control over labor, land, and communal loyalty. Through the care of their burial rituals, they spoke of a cosmology that saw death not as dissolution, but as a continuation rising with the sun to join the ancestors. Within the silent darkness of Yamna burial chambers, even the smallest objects spoke volumes about belief and identity. Among the jars and ceremonial vessels lay modest cups and shallow bowls, their surfaces traced with delicate cord-impressed designs. These were not simple containers. They were chosen tools for the soul's long passage, meant to serve the deceased as they journeyed toward the realm of honored ancestors. Each one, patterned with care, was a reminder that sustenance in the next world mirrored the dignity and refinement valued in this one. Adorning many of the dead, the shimmer of copper and bronze jewelry caught what little light filtered into the tombs. Spiral bracelets coiled around wrists, torque necklaces rested at the base of the throat, and ornate hairpieces crowned the heads of the departed. These adornments were far from random decoration. They signified the wearer's earthly standing, the network of alliances they belonged to, and the feats that had marked their lives. Strikingly, the same types of ornaments, fashioned in comparable styles, appear in graves separated by vast distances, suggesting a shared understanding of what the afterlife demanded, and perhaps centers of skilled production that supplied multiple communities with such status-laden gifts. Some of these treasures bear scars, deliberate bends, breaks, or cuts inflicted before they were laid in the grave. Such killing of objects was no accident. It signaled the transition of a possession from the human world into the keeping of the spirits, ensuring it could serve the deceased without lingering among the living. Surrounding the central graves, archaeologists often uncover further acts of devotion. The remains of sacrificed animals, carefully arranged in ways that leave no doubt these were ritual offerings. In mound after mound, cattle, sheep, and horses appear in their entirety, laid out in lifelike poses rather than scattered as butchered meat. At Berzavoka, entire cattle skeletons rest in adjacent chambers, their bones still locked in anatomical order, a silent testament to loves ended in honor, their spirits destined to accompany the human dead into the great beyond. Horses, however, received a level of care and ceremony that speaks to their elevated place in Yamna thought. At the Kutaluk cemetery, horse burials show animals settled into positions as if asleep, heads turned toward the main chamber of their human companion. They were dispatched swiftly, with blunt strikes to the skull ensuring an instant death, a final act of respect meant to carry their vital essence into the next life. In some burials, the horses were not alone. Leather bridles and wooden bits rested beside them, symbolic saddles for warriors to ride once more amid the endless pastures of the afterlife. By contrast, direct evidence of human sacrifice remains rare and controversial. A handful of burials contain bodies in unusual cramped postures without goods to their name, interred in subordinate locations within a mound. While some point to these as possible ritual killings, others argue they could be the victims of battle or disease, laid to rest differently for reasons lost to time. The balance of evidence suggests the Yamna honored their dead, not by offering human lives, but through the gifts of animals, goods, and symbols of companionship and protection. Woven throughout these burial practices is the clear thread of Yamna spirituality, a belief system that casts the sun and sky as the highest powers guiding earthly fate. Across thousands of kilometers, solar imagery recurs in carvings, pottery, and metalwork, circles edged with radiating lines, the very image of the sun's strength. Often these appear in arrangements of 4 or 8, numbers likely tied to the mapping of seasons, the turning of the sky, and the sacred rhythms that governed migration, herding, and ceremony. Animals also held a prominent place in this cosmological tapestry. Bulls stand out in carved reliefs and etched metal, their horns exaggerated into sweeping arcs, their frames brimming with muscular force, the embodiment of fertility, strength, and guardian power. Frequently they share space with solar motifs, perhaps symbolizing a divine pact between sky gods and the prosperity of the herds below, linking rains, grass, and life itself in a single sacred chain. Even the geometric patterns decorating their pots and tools may have been more than ornament. Bands of zigzags, interlocking spirals, and clusters of dots might have charted the stars, tracked phases of the moon, or marked the right times to begin a seasonal journey or pair breeding animals. On certain vessels, these arrangements align too closely with celestial events to be dismissed as mere decoration. In such markings, functional astronomy and spiritual art become indistinguishable. What is most remarkable is how steadfast these symbols remained over time and across space. From the Dnieper River in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east, the same solar disks, the same stylized animals, and the same patterned lines appear in grave after grave. Such uniformity speaks to a deeply shared faith, whether maintained by a formal religious authority or carried on the lips of traveling storytellers and ritual leaders as they moved between far-flung settlements. This shared spiritual language was as much a glue for Yamna culture as their mobility and their trade. It created an identity broad enough to span their immense territory, yet intimate enough to bind small communities together. Among the graves, a distinct group stands apart, individuals whose burials suggest a role beyond herder, warrior, or craftsman. These are the likely ritual specialists, the intermediaries between Yamna camps and the unseen powers of the world. Their mounds or chambers often contain unusual objects, carved bone plaques incised with complex designs, polished stones of rare type or vivid color, strange mineral samples collected far from the steppes, and tools with no clear function in daily life. These items may have served in divination, healing, or communion with the spiritual realm. Some of these individuals bear physical traits that may have set them apart during life: healed cranial modifications, twisted limbs, or other anomalies that later cultures often link to otherworldly insight. Certain skulls even show the marks of trepanation, the deliberate removal of a section of bone. Such procedures might have been intended to treat injury, release harmful forces, or open a gateway to visions. The fact that many of these individuals lived long after the operation shows not only surgical skill but also care for their recovery, and perhaps reverence for what they became thereafter. Other burials of probable shamans or spiritual leaders contain remnants of plant materials foreign to the steppe, including species known for their psychoactive effects. These traded across great distances, suggests that Yamna ceremonies sometimes involved altered states of consciousness, perhaps to journey into the realms of gods or ancestors. In some cases, chemical signatures found in unique vessels point to beverages brewed for such rites, fermented liquids laced with herbs to heighten awareness or facilitate visions. Even in their graves, these ritual specialists break the mold of standard Yamna burial customs. They may occupy central places in smaller mounds or lie at the edges of grander ones, their placement dictated not by the warrior's rank but by the path they walked between worlds. Through their lives and their deaths, they embodied the role of bridge, the conduit binding herder to horizon, clan to sky, and mortal life to the endless steppe beyond. Not every Yamna burial followed the same celestial logic. While the great majority of the dead lay facing east toward the rising sun, a handful thought to be ritual specialists, healers, or shamans were laid to rest facing other horizons. Some turned their gaze north, south, or west, orientations that may have reflected a unique spiritual calling, a connection to specific natural forces, or a role bound to the powers of a particular landscape. In life, these individuals may have been attuned to currents of belief outside the shared norm. In death, their very positioning set them apart. By around 3000 BC, the Yamna's restless herds and wheeled caravans began to press deep into the Danube Valley, marking the onset of what would become the largest demographic shift in Europe's prehistoric record. The meeting of these steppe pastoralists with the long-established farming societies of old Europe created a slow-burning cultural transformation. Sites such as Cernavodă in Romania and Ezero in Bulgaria capture the moment of change, layers of history in which the rhythms of settled agriculture met the hard-edged mobility of the open steppe. At first, the two worlds coexisted. In the stratified earth of places like Kova, near the lower Danube, archaeologists have uncovered phases where the pottery of the Gumilnica tradition, with its deep-rooted local styles, mingled with the cord-impressed vessels of Yamna design. This blending spanned nearly 2 centuries, proof that change was not always the work of sudden conquest, but of prolonged contact, intermarriage, shared labor, and gradual exchange of ideas. The change was clearest in how the dead were honored. In place of the collective, often ossuary-like burials of the old European tradition, the newcomers spread the custom of individual kurgan graves. These honored the person rather than the group, marking status and identity through grave goods and body positioning. At Diva Mureșului in Transylvania, a burial ground dating between 2900 and 2700 BC, holds over 300 such graves, clear evidence of locals adopting Eastern customs. Bodies here face the dawn, rest on beds of ochre, and keep copper daggers or battle axes close at hand, emblems of a warrior ethos that had arrived from far beyond the Danube plain. Living spaces changed as dramatically as burial grounds. In the Danube Valley, fortified hilltop settlements sprang up in strategic places, dominating river crossings and guarding long-distance trade corridors. One of the most significant, Vucedol in Croatia, rose on a high terrace above the river. There, evidence points to robust defensive walls, specialized workshops for crafting tools and weapons, and great storage spaces sufficient to supply a settlement of over 1,000 people. Its position gave it command of both river trade and the mineral wealth of the Carpathian ranges, copper and gold, while linking steppe pastoral economies to Mediterranean markets. With the Yamna came technological revolutions. Arsenical bronze, with its superior hardness, appeared in European workshops alongside improved casting methods that produced uniform, high-quality blades and tools. At centers like Varna and Durankalac, the remains of crucibles and precision molds show how local craftsmen absorbed and adapted steppe metallurgical techniques. Tool shapes began to standardize across the valley, suggesting not just imitation but an interconnected network of smiths, possibly sharing molds, alloys, and design templates over wide distances. Equally transformative was the spread of wheeled transport. Before, carts in old Europe were rare or absent. Afterward, they became part of the landscape. From the clay soils of Budakalas in Hungary come axle remains, wheel fragments and fittings that show steppe engineering adapted to local hardwoods and terrain. Alterations in structure and materials reveal quick innovation as European builders integrated steppe design principles with their own knowledge, creating vehicles suited for their environment. These carts in turn pulled open trade corridors that linked the Danube to the Atlantic coastlines, the Mediterranean bays, and even the far-flung resource zones of Central Asia. The deepening of contact was not only visible in objects, it seeped into language. Reconstructed Proto-Indo-European words connected to farming and metallurgy hint at the borrowing of local terms by the incoming pastoralists, while native populations adopted words that travelled from the steppe. Names for specific crop varieties, for local wildlife, and for familiar places passed between tongues during a prolonged bilingual phase. The result was a blended linguistic foundation that underpinned many of the later European versions of Indo-European speech, a subtle but enduring fusion of two civilizations' ways of naming their world. While Yamna bands pressed into the Danube, others turned south and east, riding into the North Caucasus around 2900 BC. Here, in the fertile heart of the Kuban River Valley, they met the Maikop culture, a society as technically accomplished as it was wealthy. Known for its magnificent metalwork, its towering burial mounds, and its reach into trade networks stretching to the Near East, the Maikop civilization's skills meshed with those of the steppe in a way that accelerated change for both. Archaeological records from sites such as Justa and Clady document settlements where semi-subterranean Yamna winter houses stood beside Maikop stone-built dwellings. This hybrid architecture leveraged the insulation of steppe design with the permanence and artistry of Caucasian masonry, producing homes that endured harsh winters, heavy rains, and summer heat. The partnership bore some of the most sophisticated metallurgy the ancient world had yet seen. In Maikop-controlled workshops, smiths created arsenic bronze with alloy content fine-tuned between 3 and 8%, compositions designed for specific strengths, hardness, and resilience. These techniques, shared with and adapted by Yamna craftsmen, quickly spread through both cultures' territories. Such consistency could only have arisen from sustained cooperation, perhaps even from joint schools or apprentice exchanges where metal workers learned side by side. Nor was the flow of knowledge limited to what was done at the forge. The two societies merged their approaches to transport, with Maikop metal fittings enhancing Yamna carts. Entire harness systems, preserved in rare waterlogged contexts, display bronze strap rings, distribution plates, and decorative fixtures, accoutrements far more durable and efficient than the all-organic bindings of earlier Yamna gear. These upgrades extended the range and reliability of journeys, whether for trade, herding, or war. The economic reach of this alliance was vast. From their combined territories, caravans and convoys moved goods across thousands of kilometers. Lapis lazuli from the distant mountains of Afghanistan, glimmering carnelian beads from Gujarat, Anatolian silver, and other luxuries flowed into both Yamna and Maikop sites. Such trade stitched the steppe and the Caucasus firmly into a network that touched the edges of Mesopotamia, the oases of Central Asia, and the distant shores of the Mediterranean. The story of this era is one of meeting and melding, of pastoral horsemen and cattle herders entwining destinies with farmers, miners, and master craftsmen. In the Danube basin, on the high Caucasian plains, and in the bustling graveyards and workshops of shared settlements, two worlds did not simply collide. They intertwined, setting the stage for a cultural and technological momentum that would roll forward for centuries. Stretching across rivers, forests, and mountain passes, the trade and migration corridors of the late 4th and early 3rd millennium BC required more than steady feet and strong animals. They called for an intimate knowledge of the land itself, the people of the Yamna world, and the hybrid cultures that grew from their influence, mastered the routes and seasons as if they were inscribed in memory. They knew when rivers could be forded, where winter would close a pass, and which rival groups to meet as friends or to bypass entirely. This was the skill set of a civilization in motion, one whose cultural blueprint would spread far beyond the shores of the Black Sea. That spread was never uniform, never a single conquering wave. Instead, it moved like water, flowing and eddying, carving out distinct shapes where it met different landscapes. Across Eastern and Central Europe, the result was a patchwork of regional adaptations that still bore the unmistakable stamp of their steppe origins. Among these, the corded ware culture, emerging around 2900 BC, stands out as perhaps the most successful reimagining of Yamna traditions for new surroundings. From the plains of Poland to the fjords of Scandinavia, communities began adopting traits that were clearly born of the steppe: individual burials in flat or modestly mounded graves, pottery ornamented with the long dragging impressions of twisted cord, and the warrior's prized weapon, the stone or copper battle axe. Yet woven through these foreign forms were local threads. Settlements still reflected the economies of their landscapes, mixing small-scale farming with livestock herding, an ideal blend for Europe's mixed woodlands and open clearings. At sites such as Bronowitz in Poland or Flintbeck in Germany, wooden longhouses, rectangular, timber-built and unmistakably local in style, sheltered people whose possessions spoke of the East. Pottery recovered from these houses showcases this cultural conversation: Yamna-derived cord decorations, appearing on vessel shapes inherited from generations of European potters. The clay itself tells the story, sourced from local riverbanks, tempered with sands and crushed stones found nearby. These were not imports from the steppe, but local creations in an adopted style, firing both tradition and innovation into the same vessel. The borrowing extended to the grave. In many corded ware regions, the collective tombs of Europe's earlier Neolithic gave way to individual burials tinged with steppe ritual. In place of towering kurgans, low mounds, or even flat graves sufficed, a simplification that suited communities without the vast labor pools of the original mound builders. The logic of grave goods, however, remained consistent with Yamna hierarchy: men interred with axes and weapons, women with ceramics and adornments. Yet, the sharp extremes of wealth seen in elite steppe burials were muted here. Equality, or at least a reduced display of inequality, colored the European expression of the tradition. The roots of expansion can be traced in the archaeological record like threads across a loom. Yamna-style corded pottery spreads along the arteries of the Dniester, the Prut, and the Danube, great river highways drawing in migrations from the southeast. From these main channels, secondary flows followed tributaries and mountain corridors into the heart of Europe. Burial customs ripple outward along the same paths, with the first Eastern-style graves in the lower Danube dated to around 3000 BC, reaching Central Europe by roughly 2800 BC, and touching the coasts of Scandinavia around 2600 BC. The timeline reads less like a lightning strike and more like a long advancing tide, steady season by season, generation by generation. Confirming this picture, ancient DNA closes the gap between theory and movement. Y chromosome evidence highlights the spread of R1b lineages, tied strongly to steppe ancestry, into the territories where Indo-European languages would eventually take root. Genomic studies show that some regions saw deep genetic mixing, with local lineages blending heavily with those of the migrants. Others kept their bloodlines more distinct, adopting steppe customs while retaining much of their original genetic makeup. These meeting grounds, where old and new ways traded tools, words, and rituals, became the engines of cultural transmission deeper into Europe. They were not mere way stations. They were living laboratories for hybrid societies. In some areas, the imprint of Yamna practice nearly eclipsed what came before. In others, the balance shifted toward continuity, with the newcomers' ways folded softly into existing traditions. Technology advanced along similar selective lines. The wheel rolled quickly into the flatter, more open regions where oxen or horses could pull carts unimpeded. Less so into mountain valleys or densely forested lands where sledges or pack animals still made better sense. Copper alloys spread fastest through zones rich in the ores needed for their production. Communities near sources in the Carpathians or the Alps blended Yamna bronze techniques with their own metallurgy. Those far from such veins often relied on imported objects or made do with stone. The demographic scale of this transformation ranks among the most dramatic in the human past. Between roughly 3250 and 2500 BC, the genes of the steppe would come to dominate much of Europe. By the close of that period, in many regions, 70 to 80% of the population's ancestry traced back to Yamna-related peoples. This was not the work of a single campaign or cataclysm, but the accumulation of centuries of movement, settlement, and kinship building. Skeletal records map this shift with startling clarity. In early Neolithic Europe, steppe ancestry was nearly absent, yet by 2500 BC, sites like Espostet in Germany reveal individuals whose lineage is three-quarters Yamna. The change unfolded over about 5 centuries, long enough for adaptation, integration, and coexistence alongside transformation. Archaeology helps fill in the human texture behind those percentages. Along the Rhine and across the Central Plains, new villages arose that mixed Eastern and Western design philosophies. The Wartburg culture settlements in Hesse, for example, include European-style longhouses standing alongside circular or semicircular structures reminiscent of Yamna enclosures. In the debris of daily life, cord-decorated vessels sit beside older, regionally distinctive pottery shapes. These juxtapositions are evidence of something far more complex than replacement. They speak of households and communities where two traditions lived side by side before evolving into something wholly new. In this way, the Yamna expansion was both a journey and a conversation. Its trails cut through forests and across rivers, but also wove through the homes, languages, and imaginations of countless local communities. By choosing what to adopt, what to keep, and what to blend, these hybrid societies became the carriers of an Indo-European legacy that would one day stretch from Iceland to India, not imposed all at once, but built vessel by vessel, word by word over the long course of time. The revolution that carried the Yamna people so far from their steppe homeland was built on wheels, but not just any wheels. These were the sturdy four-wheeled carts that transformed the very concept of mobility in prehistoric Europe. They were moving homes, freight wagons, travelling arsenals, and lifelines all at once. At places like Bronisus in Poland, archaeologists have uncovered fully preserved carts dating to around 2800 BC. Their solid wooden wheels measuring a precise 65 centimeters across. Encircled with iron bands, the wheels could roll for hundreds of kilometers over dirt, stone, and grass without splitting. Pulled by pairs of specially trained oxen, each vehicle could bear more than half a ton of cargo, livestock, tools, food supplies, and even pieces of shelters, across rugged plains and winding valleys. Behind this power lay a deep understanding of design. Every wheel was built in three fitted sections, the join hidden in the hub where leather gaskets and layers of animal fat eased rotation and kept grit from grinding the wood away. The cart frames were built for both strength and give flexible platforms of interwoven planks lashed with leather thongs that flexed over jolts and ruts, yet held their structure. Over the top rose arched hoops clad in canvas or cured hides, forming dry spaces that could house sleeping passengers or protect precious goods from driving rain. These were not simple farm carts. They were engineered for the demands of long-distance steppe travel. Rolling alongside this transport revolution came the edge of metal, where many communities in Europe still relied on sharpened stone for their daily tools. The Yamna were forging copper and arsenical bronze with a confidence born of long practice. Metallurgical finds from Yamna sites show tools and weapons alloyed with 3 to 6% arsenic, enough to harden the blade far beyond what pure copper could manage, while giving a pale, silvery sheen to the surface. Across thousands of kilometers, the shapes of these tools and weapons remained consistent, a sign of either traveling master smiths who passed on their trade secrets or centralized places of production that kept every item within tight quality standards. Foremost among their weapons was the steppe battle axe, balanced perfectly along its central shaft hole. This weapon demanded a complex casting process. Multi-part clay molds had to fit with absolute precision, and the molten bronze had to be poured and cooled with careful timing to keep the head strong and uniform. It was the kind of craftsmanship that took years to learn and days to execute for each weapon. The result was more than a tool of war. It was a badge of manhood, a sign of warrior status, a marker of one's place in the community hierarchy. This mobility and weaponry worked hand in hand with a pastoral economy as sophisticated as it was adaptable. The Yamna ranged over hundreds of kilometers every year, shifting with the seasons in a pattern honed by intimate knowledge of the grasslands. In winter, the clans gathered in the shelter of river valleys, where frozen winds could be deflected by ridges and woodlands. In summer, they drove their herds to upland plateaus where the nourishing grass grew thick. Annual migration routes sometimes stretched 300 or 400 kilometers, covering territory at a scale most neighboring cultures couldn't imagine. The success of these movements rested on their herds, not one species, but many. The cattle were the backbone, providing milk, meat, and the muscle for pulling those heavy carts. Sheep and goats grazed where the cattle couldn't, stripping scrub and rocky slopes while giving wool, milk, and additional meat. Horses, though scarce in the earliest phase, carried loads and hauled lighter carts, setting the stage for the mounted traditions to come. This variety meant that a single drought or disease couldn't wipe out their food supply in one blow. Different animals sought out different forage, so the whole system could adjust when part of the pasture failed. When the Yamna's paths met the ploughed fields of settled European farmers, a new kind of life began to form. In contact zones such as the Middle Danube region, communities emerged that blended the two economic worlds, herding flocks in the open land and planting barley, wheat, and other crops in its rich valleys. It was a marriage of mobility and permanence, of the grain store alongside the grazing track. Such hybrid settlements sat in positions of both economic and political strength, tapping into the trade of river and road. One such site, Vucedol in Croatia, rose high above a curve in the Danube. Its location commanded the river's traffic, giving its people control over who and what passed between the steppe and Central Europe. Excavations there reveal stout walls of local stone, echoing defensive patterns of the steppe, and a network of workshops that blended techniques from both herders and farmers. Beneath its fortifications, Vucedol stored goods enough to sustain more than 1,000 people, not counting those in the surrounding countryside who owed it loyalty. This cultural fusion was a process of selection rather than blind adoption. Communities took on what was useful and compatible with their own needs. The wheel and axle, the battle axe, the bronze blade, but often retained older house plans, farming plots, and local social structures. The Yama adopted directly in return vocabulary, knowledge of new crops, and the practical rhythms of farming in wetter, forested lands. In the languages left behind, this give and take is still visible. Words in Proto-Indo-European for certain grains and farming tools bear the fingerprints of older, pre-Indo-European tongues. Conversely, the terms for horse gear, wheeled travel, and bronze casting move into European languages from the steppe. From these exchanges, whole new cultural complexes emerged, sharing a common ancestry in the Yamna world but developing in distinct directions. The corded ware culture, spreading across the heart of Europe from the Rhine to the Volga, in the centuries after 2900 BC, became the most striking of these. Archaeology finds its roots in Yamna burial rites, vessel decoration, and weaponry, but the corded ware people adapted those forms for Europe's forests and farmlands. In their settlements, small farming hamlets often centered around timber-built longhouses, recognizably European in design, but filled with steppe-influenced artifacts. Pottery bore the signature impressed chords of Yamna style, yet the vessel shapes were those of older European kitchens and hearths. The trade routes they tapped linked the Atlantic's edge to the resource zones of Central Asia, moving goods and ideas at a scale no previous European culture had matched. Their graves, too, told of steppe ancestry without copying it in full. The dead no longer lay in giant kurgans. Instead, low mounds or even flat graves often sufficed. But the bodies were contracted in the old way, heads turned toward the dawn, a sprinkling of ochre at their sides, and weapons or pottery close at hand. This was the Yamna ideal, simplified, reshaped, but not forgotten, carried forward into a Europe that was no longer wholly the farmers or the herders alone, but something new born from both. The graves of hybrid corded ware communities reveal how Yamna traditions took root far from their birthplace, yet shifted subtly to fit European realities. Gender roles still left their mark in death, but the specifics hint at different balances of power. Men almost always went to rest with weapons, the battle axe above all, a clear emblem of the warrior's path, while women were given pottery, ornaments, and the tools of daily life, such as spindle whorls, grinders, and other instruments tied to food and textile production. Yet these were no token offerings. The fineness of the vessels, the quality of the jewelry, and the quantity of goods in some women's graves speak to real influence. In these blended worlds, women may have overseen key agricultural tasks and directed specialized crafts, anchoring the economic life of their communities while their male counterparts patrolled and defended. Only slightly later, around 2800 BC, another pattern emerged, one that would sweep from Iberia to the edges of Eastern Europe. This was the bell beaker culture, a phenomenon shaped by Yamna's far reach, but also by deep-rooted European traditions and the pull of Mediterranean style. The name comes from their pottery, elegant vessels that flare outward in the unmistakable shape of a turned bell. These were more than utilitarian containers. Each was a mark of identity, expertly made and decorated to match a widely shared design language, suggesting specialist potters and an active exchange of both goods and ideas. Bell beaker metallurgy pushed the craft forward again, blending step alloying techniques with influences from the Atlantic coasts and the Mediterranean. Copper and early bronze here were smelted and cast into weapons and tools of remarkable consistency and durability. The forms from daggers to chisels to axes remained standard over immense distances, hinting at either central workshops or a fraternity of skilled smiths scattered over the realm, maintaining shared methods as if bound by a guild charter. Their burials echo the Yamna template, but refract it through local and foreign lenses alike. Across Western Europe, individual graves show bodies drawn into the contracted Yamna posture, their faces toward the dawn. Alongside them lie signature pieces, the bell-shaped pots, copper daggers, polished stone wrist guards for archery, sometimes even beads or ornaments of gold, each a sign that the dead had access to trade flowing far and wide. The tombs themselves, however, differ from kurgans. Construction techniques shift with the materials and customs of the region, from simple earth mounds to stone-lined chambers that recall older European rites. What took root here was more than just new objects. It was a remodeled worldview. European societies that had once leaned toward shared egalitarian structures increasingly turned toward hierarchy and individual achievement. The warrior, the leader, the master crafter, these roles rose in prominence. With them came sharper distinctions of wealth and status, amplifying differences that had once been muted. The changes were tied tightly to technology. Stronger weapons, better tools, new forms of production and movement. Together they reshaped how wealth could be made and displayed and how ambition could be rewarded. Trade blossomed under these new arrangements, weaving connections that linked the Atlantic shore to the mountains of Central Asia. Archaeological traces show a lattice of specialized production centers, smithies near copper-rich alpine veins, amber workshops in the Baltic lands, pottery kilns turning out uniform vessels for exchange. Goods rode across this web in quantities and over distances unseen before, carrying not only material wealth but the seeds of shared knowledge. Yet as Yamna influence moved west, other groups pressed east around 3300 BC. Even earlier than the Bell-beaker wave, steppe clans turned their gaze beyond the Urals. The barrier was formidable, but on the other side lay the endless grasslands of western Siberia, rolling east toward the Altai and beyond. This migration stands as one of prehistory's great crossings, ferrying more than people. It carried an entire cultural package, the wheeled carts, the herding strategies, the burial rites into an utterly new environment. The Urals were crossed not in a single leap, but along long-learned corridors, river valleys and mountain passes that permitted ox-drawn wagons to climb and descend without stalling. Along the Tobol River, shallow gradients and steady water made it a favored path. Archaeological hints, fragments of Yamna-style pottery on high ridges, suggest that some groups chose harder, more direct climbs, perhaps trading ease for speed. On reaching the far side, they stepped into a different world. The steppes of Siberia gave way to a richer mosaic of habitats, broad grasslands, sheltering forests, fertile river floodplains, all laced together in the Minusинsk basin, where many Afanaseyevo communities eventually settled. The opportunities were immense, but so were the demands for adaptation. Camps shifted to higher terraces above rivers, both for the view, a tactical advantage, and for protection against floods in the spring thaw. The climate bit harder here. Winters slammed down to 30 degrees Celsius or worse. Summers flared briefly but with a ferocity that ripened dense grass. Each year's swing from bitter to lush forced an overhaul in herding practice. Pasture strategies became more exacting. Winter now demanded solid shelters, timber-walled and earth-covered tight against the cold. It meant cutting and storing fodder in summer to bridge the hungry months, an extra demand on labor and planning. Vegetation patterns imposed new logic on movement. Dense conifer stands could supply building wood and fire fuel, but blocked the open-flowing paths of the Pontic steppe. The herders learned to graze forest clearings while keeping main camps in open reaches that gave room to maneuver large herds. Forests also offered game, wild plants, and the materials for new designs in wagons and homesteads. Even the rivers here demanded close reading. Siberia's waterways did not flow and branch like those of the West, and migration routes had to be redrawn to follow freshwater sources across an unfamiliar compass. Campsites were chosen with precision, near water, above floodlines within reach of both forest edge and pasture. In all of this, in the graves of Europe's hybrid corded ware and bell beaker communities, in the fortified markets of Vuchedol, in the wagon wheel ruts of the Tobol Valley, and the new-built shelters under Siberia's pines, the Yamna expansion shows its true nature. It was never a single march of conquest. It was a many-threaded weave of adaptation, negotiation, and transformation, a culture that could root itself in the Atlantic wind or the Siberian frost, and still remain recognizably its own. The Yenisei River and its branching tributaries wound their way across this vast land, offering a steady lifeline through the seasons. Yet unlike the familiar east-west watercourses of the Pontic steppe, these rivers carved long north-south corridors into the heart of Siberia. The Afanasyevo settlers, descendants of the Yamna pioneers, learned quickly to anchor their base camps beside these great waterways, while sending smaller groups to occupy seasonal outposts high in the uplands whenever the pastures ripened. This rhythm allowed them to graze animals over vast ranges without exhausting local forage. Here in western Siberia, the newcomers found they were not alone. The land was home to scattered bands of indigenous hunter-gatherers, masters of survival in a place that could freeze in deep winter and flare into life during brief green summers. These native groups possessed an intimate understanding of the terrain, where the best chert beds lay hidden, which valleys stayed sheltered from snowdrifts, how to read the waters for fish and crossing points. Rather than sweeping these communities aside, the Afanasio appear to have sought alliance in exchange. In return for meat, milk, and other pastoral goods, they received local knowledge and access to prized resources, fine-grained jasper, colorful minerals, and stone types unknown in the steppes. The archaeological record tells the story of this partnership. At sites like Karaikal, pottery sherds carry the cord-impressed decorations so distinctive of Yamna heritage, but the shapes themselves follow local Siberian traditions. It was fusion, not replacement, each side contributing to a shared toolkit while maintaining its own identity. Over time, entirely new regional material styles emerged within Afanasyevo lands, blending steppe traditions with innovations born of the north. Stone tools evolved accordingly. Instead of relying solely on steppe sources and knapping styles, Afanasyevo craftsmen adopted local flaking techniques and quarried the region's superior raw materials, jaspers and chalcedonies from the Altai that produced edges keener and more durable than those of many earlier steppe blades. These rugged implements proved ideal for hide scraping in frigid climates, woodworking for heavy shelters, and butchery during the intense but short hunting seasons. Metalworking, too, was shaped by the land. The Afanasyevo continued Yamna traditions in copper and bronze, but the Altai's rich copper veins, chemically distinct from the Caucasus ores, required new smelting approaches. Local tin sources were soon tapped to produce true tin bronze, harder and more resistant to corrosion than earlier arsenical blends. Workshop sites cling to the base of the mountains, where mining left a lace of shallow pits and horizontal galleries cut into the slopes. Here, ore was crushed with stone hammers, rinsed in water-filled basins, and smelted in clay furnaces hot enough to turn raw rock into easily transported ingots. The sheer extent of these mining operations and the infrastructure around them points to coordinated labor and specialized craft groups, a sign that copper production had become a cornerstone of Afanasyevo wealth. In death, they still honored the old ways, but now in stone. Kurgans in the Altai often enclosed their tombs with slab-built chambers, the rock pulled from local quarries and shaped to fit snugly. These stone-lined rooms preserved wood, textiles, and even organic remains that would have long vanished from earthen graves. Some burial complexes were far more elaborate than those of the western steppe, their multiple chambers linked by narrow stone corridors forming miniature subterranean houses for the dead. It was Kurgan building adapted to a land rich in rock, but poor in the dense topsoil needed for high earthen mounds. The goods that travelled into these tombs spoke two languages, one of deep Yamna inheritance, the other of a fresh frontier. Copper daggers and battle axes followed designs from the homeland, yet beside them lay ornaments worked from jade and serpentine, stones drawn from Asian sources beyond the steppes. These pieces mark new trade routes stretching into Central Asia, the Altai becoming a bridge between worlds. Pottery remained cord decorated, marking its makers as part of that broader steppe identity, but its shapes and clays bore the stamp of local adaptation. Same hand techniques, but new fabrics and forms tailored to Siberian life. Herding in this harsh land demanded more than the old methods. The Afanasevo kept cattle as their mainstay, but survival through Siberian winters meant building large shelters and stacking fodder well before the frosts. When pasture lay buried under snow, stored hay and gathered grains kept the herds alive. They also broadened their animal economy. In some herds, yaks appear alongside cattle, the perfect answer to high-altitude grazing and deep cold. These animals could thrive where cows struggled, offering milk rich in fat, meat for the toughest months, and sturdy fiber for ropes, clothing, and felt. Sheep and goats still played their roles, nibbling on marginal land and providing wool and milk. Horses, meanwhile, appear to have taken on greater significance than in many Western Yamna groups. The sheer scale of Siberian ranges made long-distance herd management and communication critical, and breeding trends show a move toward larger, stronger animals capable of hauling heavier loads and traveling further between water and pasture. Horse burials from this period reveal animals with more robust frames than their Pontic cousins, and some carry the faint telltale wear of bits, hints that mounted riding, still rare in earlier centuries, may have been gaining ground here. If so, the seeds of what would become a revolution in steppe warfare and mobility may have been planted in this very frontier, where the old ways of the West met the stark realities of the East, and innovation was the price of survival. Every adaptation, from the yak in the herd to the tin in the bronze, was a step in transforming the Yamna legacy into something distinctly Siberian, the Afanaseovo way. The Afanaseovo world adapted itself to Siberia's rhythms without losing the heart of the steppe. Their settlement patterns were as fluid as the seasons, built around a network of sites designed to wring every advantage from the landscape. Winter brought them into sheltered valleys where the winds lost their bite and the hills guarded their camps. Here, base settlements became the social anchors of the year. Come spring and summer, people and herds dispersed along upland routes, moving between satellite camps close to seasonal streams and the short-lived, lush pastures that flared green before fading back to dust. Such adaptability did not come overnight. It was the product of years, decades of exploration, and of absorbing the knowledge of those who had long called these lands home. The Afanaseovo met the challenge of Siberia not in isolation but through cooperative exchanges with its indigenous peoples, whose understanding of local grazing cycles, mineral sources, and safe travel routes proved as valuable as any tool or weapon. This knowledge folded naturally into the other great strength of Afanaseovo society, its place within one of the most ambitious trade networks of the prehistoric era. From their camps in the Altai and Minor Sints basins, goods could travel in both directions across Eurasia. Archaeological finds in Altaisanadiovo territory tell the story vividly. Warm honey-coloured amber from the Baltic, shimmering Mediterranean shells, turquoise worked in Central Asia, and smooth green Chinese jade that had travelled thousands of kilometres to rest here. Managing these arteries of commerce required more than pack animals and strong wheels. It meant knowing the lay of every pass and river, forging diplomatic ties with many different groups, and securing safe conduct for goods that could be both valuable and dangerous to carry. The Afanaseovo became bridges between worlds, ferrying European metals eastward and returning with the precious stones and luxury goods of Asia. The flow of materials was matched by a flow of skills, craft methods, alloy secrets, and decorative styles moved hand in hand with tangible goods. One result was the rapid and wide spread of technical improvements. Across the network, new bronze recipes appeared, richer in tin for greater hardness and cleaner casting. Molds grew more complex, allowing blades, tools, and ornaments to emerge from the furnace with precision and strength unmatched in earlier centuries. For the Afanaseovo, such advances strengthened their own pastoral economy by giving them better equipment to manage herds, travel long distances, and defend themselves, all while reinforcing their role as vital partners to the settled farming societies beyond their horizon. The cultural current ran both ways. In the Altai and beyond, local groups began adopting practices learned from their Afanaseovo neighbours, burying their dead under small kurgans, shaping pots with corded decoration, and smelting copper or bronze in ways that reflected steppe lineage. These adoptions fed into the gradual rise of more complex societies in the centuries that followed, laying early foundations for the rich cultures of later Central Asia. But by around 2500 BC, the Yamna cultural order that had first spawned the Afanasiovo was fragmenting, giving way to a patchwork of related but distinct traditions. Each successor kept elements of the old way, pastoral mobility, wheel-making, bronze casting, but bent them to fit new ecologies and new blends of people. Among the most direct heirs were the catacomb culture communities, spread across the lower Don and Volga valleys. The catacomb people carried forward the prestige of grand burial, but transformed its architecture. Instead of surface chambers beneath high mounds, they dug down deep vertical shafts that dropped 3 or 4 meters below the earth before opening into side chambers hollowed from the soil. These underground catacombs demanded careful engineering and patient labor. Stone slabs, sometimes hauled in from kilometers away, sealed the entrances. Timber bracing guarded against collapse while the work was underway. The result was a hidden resting place where grave goods and even fragile organic materials could survive intact for millennia. The old eastward orientation of the dead still held meaning, yet body positions were more varied. Some lay curled in the familiar fetal pose. Others stretched out full length, a small departure from tradition that may reflect changing spiritual ideas. Men still went to their graves with copper and bronze weapons, but the vessels beside them had evolved. Cord impressions gave way to stamp, incision, and applique techniques that layered complex geometric patterns over the clay. Sites like Mikhailovsky and Perovsky yield pots with carefully sequenced designs, stamped motifs alternating with incised lines, and applied ribbons of clay that required not only artistry but planning. That such styles appear consistently across the culture's reach suggests either specialized centers producing them for a broad area or craftsmen in regular contact, their skills and designs circulating like any other traded good. Metalwork, too, continued to climb in refinement. By this time, smiths enjoyed steady access to tin, allowing them to produce true bronze on a scale their Yamna forebears could not match. The alloys were consistent, the smelting cleaner, more intricate casting techniques made possible socketed axe heads, well-balanced daggers, and narrow-bladed tools for specialized crafts like leatherworking. Agricultural implements, stronger and sharper, allowed deeper tilling where soils permitted, feeding the steady overlap between mobile pastoralism and part-time farming. In the Middle Volga region, the Poltavka culture was following its own evolutionary line from the Yamna stock. These people remained wedded to mobility on the open range, but their material culture marked them as distinct. Burials simplified the once monumental kurgan, replacing towering mounds with more modest earthworks that still preserved the key symbols of steppe funerary life. The pottery of Poltavka sites differs from both Yamna and catacomb examples, its rims shaped with local flair, its surfaces marked by geometric designs applied through both cord and simple incision. These forms served the twin needs of utility and identity, carrying forward steppe tradition, while also telling you at a glance that you were in Poltavka country. Through all these changes, whether in the high engineering of catacomb tombs, the stylized vessels of Poltavka camps, or the hybrid exchanges of the Afanasiovo trade routes, the soul of the steppe endured. Herds still moved with the seasons, carts still cut lines across the horizon, and the grave still faced the sunrise, as if to remind all who came after that life, like the sun, was always part of a larger cycle. The pottery of the Poltavka and later Pavlovka worlds still bore the familiar cord-impressed decoration of the steppe, but chemical analysis shows these vessels were made with local clays and tempers. This wasn't the output of a central workshop, it was hands-on, community-based craft, adapted to whatever resources each settlement had at hand. Pots, like the people who shaped them, carried the DNA of old Yamna tradition while being firmly anchored in the soil and rivers around them. At the heart of the Pavlovka economy, cattle remained the bedrock, the measure of wealth, the engine of travel, the larder on the hoof. Yet the bones in their refuse piles tell of change. More and more sheep and goat remains appear compared to earlier Yamna sites. It's a sign of adaptation. In drier zones, small, hardy ruminants thrived where cattle might struggle. This was a pragmatic shift, adjusting the herd to fit the land. Horses took on an even greater role. Archaeological finds from the period show clear evidence of deliberate breeding for larger, stronger animals, beasts capable of carrying a rider or pulling heavier loads over long distances. Horse size and bone sturdiness in these sites far outstrip those of earlier generations, hinting at an accelerating program to refine the steppe's most transformative partner in mobility. Mobility still defined the Pavlovka lifestyle, but settlement patterns reveal a keen awareness of their territories. Seasonal sites formed a web across grazing lands, structured to make use of pastures at precise times of year. Some locations bear the signs of repeated return over decades, bound to clans by tradition and necessity. Winter brought them into more permanent camps, their semi-subterranean homes with deep-set hearths built for fuel economy in bitter cold. These were not temporary shelters but engineered spaces, insulated, smoke-controlled and built to endure the hardest months. By 1800 BC, a new cultural horizon rose from this matrix. Shrubnaya, the late Bronze Age flower of the steppe. Here, centuries of experimentation in metalwork, mobility and social order reached full maturity. At sites like Prosk and Alexandrovka, archaeologists uncover signs of unprecedented craft specialization and integration into sprawling trade networks, all while the economy still leaned on the old formula, livestock first. Shrubnaya's graves mark a bold shift. The stone chambers of earlier eras gave way to log-framed tombs, rectangular burial rooms built from thick, fitted timbers. These wooden vaults, carefully weatherproofed, preserved both body and goods with astonishing fidelity. Such carpentry required more than skill with an axe. It needed access to high-quality timber, either from nearby forests or via long-distance trade. What's striking is the consistency. From one end of Shrubnaya territory to the other, the building method is near identical, a sign of either roving specialists or a shared training tradition across vast distances. In their bronzes, Shrubnaya smiths reached the high-water mark of steppe metallurgy. Furnaces of advanced design, multi-part molds and alloys, optimally balanced with tin, replaced the cruder arsenical blends of centuries past. The tools and weapons they cast, harder, sharper, and longer-lasting, set a new standard, whether destined for war, herding, or craft. It's here that the deep roots of Yamna tradition show how far they had spread. Linguistic, genetic, and archaeological strands together point to a network of influence stretching from the Atlantic to South Asia. In Western Europe, Celtic societies retained the echoes, in their sky-worshipping rituals, in the warrior aristocracies that ruled by martial prowess, and in the bronze and wheel-making technologies their metallurgists practiced. Many chieftains were buried much as a Yamna elite would have been, weapons in hand, personal ornaments gleaming, barrows raised above them, though moulded into the shapes demanded by Atlantic landscapes and resources. Among Germanic peoples, the inheritance took a similar form: social ranks built on personal valor, warrior bands bound by oaths, and cosmologies centered on sky and storm. Archaeology finds early Germanic graves and settlements that still carry structural and symbolic links back to the steppe. Even the runic scripts and myth cycles that formed millennia later sit on an Indo-European linguistic bedrock, whose outlines trace back to Proto-Indo-European speech, the same tongue the Yamna once spoke. The Slavic continuum holds perhaps the most direct line. Through centuries and across shifting borders, their burial customs, village layouts, and economic strategies show clear descent from the old pastoral heartlands. Slavic languages preserve a dense cluster of Proto-Indo-European terms for pastoral life, kinship, and sky deities. In their farming and herding balanced economies, the ghosts of steppe know-how still move. But nowhere is the Yamna imprint outside the steppe more dramatic than in the Indo-Iranian sphere. Here, both archaeology and linguistics agree. Actual population movement carried the cultural complex eastward. Vedic Sanskrit texts, oral for centuries before being written, preserve images straight from the ancient Eurasian grasslands. The horse as partner and possession, the chariot as symbol of speed and power, the sky gods who watch warriors earn their fame. Sites like Sintashta and Arkaim in the southern Urals, rising around 2100 BC, form the bridge between their steppe ancestors and the Indo-Iranian future. These were no mere camps, they were planned and fortified settlements, circular in plan, with defences, wells, and specialized workshops. Inside the walls, a metallurgical culture thrived, producing weapons, tools, and the gear for a steppe invention poised to change everything: the spoked wheel chariot. The chariots of Sintashta were light, fast, and built for war and display alike. Complete examples preserved in waterlogged graves show wheels with fine, evenly spaced spokes, frames of carefully joined woods and bronze fittings to bind the whole together while keeping weight low. Specialists trained horses to pull them at speed, turning the old pack and plough animal into a partner for swift, decisive movement across battlefield or plain. From these hubs, the technology and the people who mastered it radiated outward, carrying with them not only material goods and military advantages, but also the social models, belief systems, and language heritage rooted in Yamna centuries before. The legacy of the steppe had crossed yet another threshold, reinventing itself again, and laying foundations that would shape civilizations from Ireland to India. The rise of the chariot was not just about wheels and wood, it was about the animals that pulled them. Forging a true warhorse capable of speed, stamina, and steady nerves demanded generation of careful breeding. It was a program that valued the fleet over the merely strong, the controllable over the wild. By the time the chariot became both a weapon and a ceremonial showpiece, the herds of the steppe were producing horses bred for this exact role. The genetic legacy of these animals, and of the people who bred them, still runs through modern populations. Today, genome studies of Europeans show that between 30 and 60% of their ancestry carries markers from the Yamna and their related steppe kin. Percentages vary with geography and time, highest in the north and east, where Baltic and Slavic communities kept stronger territorial and cultural ties to the old heartlands. In the west, the share is smaller but still substantial, a residue of the Great Bronze Age mingling that reshaped the continent's face. The paternal lineages tell the same tale. The Y chromosome haplogroups R1b and R1er, once the genetic signatures of steppe pastoralists, are found from Iberia to Siberia, closely tracing the frontiers of ancient Indo-European language expansion. These patterns don't just fit with the archaeological record, they strengthen it, showing that the movement of Yamna culture was also a movement of people in vast numbers, not simply the drift of ideas. Variations within those lineages speak to multiple waves of expansion, each one rolling into different corners of Europe during distinct centuries. The story extends far beyond Europe. In Central Asia, steppe bloodlines remain deeply embedded. Among Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and other nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples, the percentage of steppe-derived ancestry remains high, evidence of an unbroken link across thousands of years to the Yamna themselves. Here, genetics, archaeology, and language converge. The speech of Central Asia carries echoes of the old Indo-European root system, just as its burial customs and herd-based economies still carry the stamp of their origins. South Asia's genetic record tells a more complex story, one braided from the Indo-Aryan expansions of the second millennium BC and the long coexistence with entrenched local civilizations. Steppe ancestry appears uneven across the region, higher among groups speaking Indo-European languages and maintaining traditions that match steppe patterns in ritual and social order. The genetic timelines align neatly with the archaeological pulse of cultural change: new pottery styles, new burial rites, the integration of horse and chariot into both practical life and religious symbolism. These continuities go well beyond the grave. Many later Indo-European speaking cultures, whether in Europe, Asia Minor, or the Indian subcontinent, carried forward tactical and organizational habits bound to the pastoral origins of the steppe. Fortified hilltops became watchtowers and safe havens, controlling movement and trade in the way that high riverside bluffs had once done across the Pontic plains. Though adapted to local landscapes, the settlement logic was unchanged: defendable positions, open space for animals, and easy routes to seasonal pastures or markets. The material culture tells its own long story of inheritance: metallurgy, pottery making, textile craft. Each in later Indo-European societies carries the fingerprints of steppe innovators. In metalwork, the leap from copper to bronze and from simple cast tools to complex multi-piece molds and standardized weapon types follows a line that begins in Yamna workshops. Pottery designs and methods evolved, but often retained the structural principles: sturdy profiles, quick production techniques, and decorative schemes balancing utility with identity. that defined steppe ceramics. Even in woven cloth, there is evidence of direct lineage from Bronze Age weaving techniques, passed through generations of specialist makers. Such inherited skills weren't just about daily life. They gave Indo-European cultures an edge in survival, expansion, and influence, sustaining dominance in diverse and often hostile environments. Modern understanding of all this starts in the late 19th century. In the 1880s, Russian archaeologist Vasily Gorodtsov began opening mounds along the Don River. What he found, singular burials in crouched postures, cord-impressed pottery, copper blades, was unlike anything from the Neolithic farming cultures further west. His detailed notes on the position of bodies, the layout of grave goods, and the construction of the burial mounds became the foundation for what would soon be recognized as an entirely distinct prehistoric culture. In the early 20th century, research widened under scholars like Mikhail Artamonov and Alexei Tyrinoskin, who with state backing sent large teams into the grasslands of Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan. Their efforts yielded not tens but thousands of Yamna graves, stretching across the steppe belt and showing a striking consistency in ritual and material. The Berezovka cemetery excavations in the 1950s were a landmark. Over 200 burials that mapped out social hierarchies in detail, and trade links spanning from the Caucasus to the distant south and west. Working under the Soviet system, archaeologists emphasized exhaustive documentation and comparative statistical analysis. Every mound was sketched, every find catalogued and measured, and all of it was fed into expanding databases. From these, scholars like Leo Klen and Igor Diakonov developed pottery typologies, mapped regional variants in burial form, and refined the chronology of Yamna expansion. They demonstrated that while the culture was unified by certain core traits, it also housed regional offshoots shaped by local resources and climates. Cold War isolation ironically deepened that expertise. Limited access to Western scholarship meant Soviet research pushed inward, amassing a level of regional excavation detail unmatched elsewhere. Hundreds of burial complexes were dug on a common methodological template, allowing precise cross-comparison from the Black Sea to Central Asia. What emerged was a picture not just of Yamna life, but of its diffusion, how elements of the culture were adopted, altered, and transmitted into new societies over centuries. By the late 1960s, Western scholars began weaving these Soviet revelations into their own models. Chief among them was Maria Gimbutas, whose Kurgan hypothesis argued that the mound-building Yamna were the Proto-Indo-Europeans, the linguistic ancestors of hundreds of later languages. Her vision, a steppe-born wave of migration altering the face of Europe, was provocative, sparking decades of debate even as it cemented the Yamna as a key to Europe's deep past. In the same decade, radiocarbon dating finally put absolute numbers to the Yamna timeline. No longer bound to relative sequences based on pottery style or soil layers, archaeologists could now date each site with far greater confidence. This revolution in chronology confirmed the broad sweep drawn by linguists and artifact analysts that from the late 4th through the 3rd millennium BC, waves of people and culture radiated outward from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, reshaping the prehistoric world. And in every layer of this story, from the bones of chariot horses to the genomes of modern peoples, from a copper axe in a Transylvanian grave to the wheel marks in a Ural pass, the imprint of the Yamna still lingers, a reminder of how mobility, adaptation, and cultural transmission knit together the ancient world. The evidence for the steppe homeland theory rests on more than skeletal remains and ancient pottery. One of its strongest pillars comes from an unlikely source. The wheel, archaeology and linguistics, working in tandem, have shown that the speakers of Proto-Indo-European not only knew the wheel, but knew it well enough to give it a rich technical vocabulary. Reconstructed words for axle, wheel, yoke, and draft animals match almost perfectly with the physical remains found across Yamna sites. A fusion of language and artifact that leaves little doubt these were people who mastered wheeled transport. Chronology seals the case. The emergence of this transport technology aligns precisely with the linguistic branching of Proto-Indo-European, supporting the model of a mobile society whose innovations in travel enabled waves of expansion. From the open steppe, those wheels rolled outward, carrying not just goods and families but whole cultures into new territories. The same synergy appears in metallurgy. Linguistic reconstructions of early Indo-European preserved terms for copper, bronze, and the acts of smelting and casting, concepts matched in the archaeological record by the Yamna's own sophisticated metalwork. The standard shapes of tools and weapons found from the Dniester to the Volga suggest either tightly coordinated production centers or a network of highly skilled smiths who maintained exacting standards despite the distances between them. This was more than simple craftsmanship. It was a technological system, one that gave the steppe a decisive material advantage. That advantage fueled an expansion whose timing and scale we now know better than ever. Advances in radiocarbon dating have allowed researchers to divide nearly a millennium of Yamna history into clearer phases. The earliest, simpler centuries feature modest social differentiation and less elaborate trade. Over time, the picture changes. Later phases reveal stratified societies with long-distance exchange systems and more complex political structures. These refinements mirror the growing scope of their movement and their influence. By pulling together archaeological finds, genetic mapping, and linguistic patterns, researchers have traced the Yamna expansion as a series of waves rather than a single tidal surge. Different phases carried distinct mixes of cultural practices, technologies, and genetic lineages into different regions. In some areas, the newcomers arrived with the full package of burial customs, pottery styles, and herd economies. In others, they transmitted only select innovations which blended with existing ways to form hybrid cultures. The more we learn about these expansions, the clearer it becomes that they were not random wanderings. They were organized, deliberate, and capable of sustaining community life and identity across enormous distances. Today, cutting-edge research digs even deeper. Proteomic studies examine residues on ancient artifacts to understand diet and craft materials. Isotope analysis reconstructs migration routes, seasonal herd movements, and even the childhood origins of individuals buried far from their birthplaces. Computational modeling uses all these data to simulate how whole populations could move and interact across the vastness of ancient Eurasia. Each of these disciplines adds a layer to the portrait of Yamna society, a culture both highly mobile and highly structured, capable of adapting its lifeways to new environments without losing its core. Their impact far outlasted the gleam of their own bronze blades. The wheel and wagon system they pioneered became a motor for later expansions, carrying traders and tribes along newly linked landscapes. Trade routes that sprang from Yamna mobility knit together territories separated by thousands of kilometers, funneling not just goods but ideas and innovations. Their metallurgy, too, was more than a moment in time. The alloys, casting methods, and standardized forms that Yamna smiths developed became part of the technological foundation of the Bronze Age in both Europe and Asia. From these seeds grew the weaponry, tools, and ornaments of cultures that never saw the Pontic steppe but nonetheless inherited its knowledge. Equally enduring were their social blueprints. The Yamna emphasis on individual achievement, warrior prestige, and hierarchy formed a social grammar that Indo-European speaking societies would adapt to their own needs. In Greece's Homeric heroes, in the aristocratic warrior bands of the Celts, in the mounted nobility of the Indo-Iranians, the outlines of Yamna's status culture can still be seen. These values, martial prowess, competitive display, and the authority of lineage, gave their inheritors tools for both cohesion and conquest. It is this continuity stretching across thousands of years and countless cultural transformations that makes the Yamna story so significant. They were not just another Bronze Age people, they were a turning point, a society whose combination of mobility, technology, and organization became the seed stock for linguistic families, genetic lineages, and cultural norms that still shape vast swaths of Eurasia. The rise of such a society was a product of its environment and its ingenuity in equal measure. Mobile pastoralism let them command the steppe's resources, wheeled transport, let them connect far-flung lands. Metallurgy gave them cutting tools, durable weapons, and symbols of power, and their social order provided the framework to coordinate large-scale action, whether in herding, warfare, or migration. Modern research only deepens this picture. Every ancient genome sequenced, every potsherd chemically analyzed, every reconstructed word tested against material evidence adds precision to our understanding. yet it also reveals how much more there is to know. The Yamnaya are both a well-understood culture and an open question, a keystone of prehistory whose edges continue to expand as new finds emerge. Their legacy is written in the living languages of Indo-European descent, in the shared genetic threads running through millions, and in the deep cultural patterns from social ranks to mythic archetypes that first cohered on the Eurasian steppe. Studying them is not only about peering back into the 3rd millennium BC, it is a way to trace the outlines of the world we live in now, back to one of its earliest and most influential architects. The Yaman story is, in essence, one of roots of words, of peoples, of technologies and traditions. And as science continues to refine those roots, we see ever more clearly how a pastoral nation on the great grass oceans of Eurasia helped give rise to the continents we know today.